Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Hugo Shakeshaft. Hugo is a classicist, art historian. He's a specialist in the cultural history of ancient Greece and its legacy. His research ranges across ancient literature, history, philosophy, art, and archaeology. And at the heart of his work is this fascination with aesthetics and how people in antiquity perceive the world. He has a degree in classics from Emmanuel College at University of Cambridge. He also has a master's in classical archaeology and a doctorate in ancient history at Lincoln College at University of Oxford. He is currently the A.W. Mellon Postdoc Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And he is the author of the wonderful book, Beauty and the Gods, A History from Homer to Plato. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We talk about beauty in ancient Greece and its impact on modern times, architecture and beauty, beauty and aesthetics and what the differences are there. Talk about the gods and beauty. We talk about the relationship between humans and the gods. We talk about superficial versus a deeper beauty, beauty in nature, beauty as power, the role of religion, and many other topics. This was such a fun conversation. Hugo's a great guy, really sharp, very clear in his writing, how he talks about this. I really enjoyed it. It's something that, on one hand, I feel like everyone talks about, and on the other hand, not at all, as kind of at the same time. He has such almost a surgical way of just kind of cutting right through the essence of, what is it like for beauty in the ancients. And the book is marvelous, and he was just a real delight to talk to. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, subscribe, share with your friends. Much appreciated. And now I bring you Hugo Shakeshaft. I am here with Hugo Shakeshaft. Hugo, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, you have written a absolutely wonderful book. As I was telling you before we started, I had a very long flight recently, and I read it in the whole flight back. It was one sitting essentially is what I read the book. So it is very good, extremely well written. The book is called Beauty and the Gods: A History from Homer to Plato, and it really is. It's what it is. When you read a lot of history or the classics or things like that, you start to hear similar themes. People kind of pick up on the same things, which is totally normal. It's totally fine, and people have nuanced ways or debates or things like that. But this book really felt. Again, I'm sure you're not the first person to talk about this, but it really how you put it all together felt very novel, and for something that you're talking about Homer and you're talking about Plato and Greece, ancient Greece, and all these things. And these things feel familiar. We've had a lot of things in literature and books written, and even in films. But this felt very novel. And so I didn't know I was going to get on every page. So yeah, just fantastic stuff. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. That's really kind of you to say. It's funny saying it feels novel because it's both a subject that is in one sense very familiar, right?
Mm.
So even this idea to look like a Greek god is still in our popular culture today, right? Like if you go on YouTube and write "look like a Greek god," you're going to be inundated with all these exercise programs of how you can look like a Greek god in just 12 weeks, right? So it's very much maybe don't trust what you see. But,
No, don't trust that.
But the point is that it's still like an idea that's very present in our popular culture. And it was interesting in the kind of when I was looking for a subject for this book. So this book grew out of my doctoral research, and when I was looking for a subject for a doctorate, I was thinking a bit about these stories where gods show themselves to humans, and one of the things that's emphasized is beauty when that happens, the beauty of the gods. And then it occurred to me, what about more broadly this relationship between beauty and the gods? And it kind of occurred to me that it's so obvious in a way that it was kind of hiding in plain sight. That was the point. Like, we just take it so for granted that Greek gods are beautiful, that it's never really been kind of pressed and looked at in much depth. And so that was really the driving force behind a lot of the project.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is you kind of give some of those references as well, where there is this. Yeah, it's something that I think we do take for granted. I've also seen those ads as well. Not that I'm searching for that, but yes, I've right. There's plenty of things like that. So before we get into a lot of the book, why don't you just tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, all the relevant pieces there.
Okay, yeah. So I'm currently a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So I moved here with my wife in September from the UK, from Oxford, which is where I've been for the last 11 years, I think it is. So besides a year at Harvard, I did all of my graduate study at Oxford. So I did a master's in classical archaeology there, and then a PhD. They call it a DPhil, weirdly, in Oxford, which no one else outside of Oxford understands. But I did my PhD in Oxford in ancient history, and then my first postdoctoral fellowship there as well at Christchurch College. So that's a little bit about my background and how I've landed on the other side of the pond in America.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We have an interesting relationship with the United Kingdom, and I was talking to somebody recently, and I said, "Yeah, if you're ever over here on this side of the pond," and she said, "I don't know if I want to come there right now." She's like, all of the American rebels are acting up again. I said, "Yeah, I know. Well, that's what we do, right? Isn't that what we do?" So, yeah, that's very, very, very funny. Okay, so this idea of beauty, especially with ancient Greece, you were kind of mentioning it there, that it's sort of hidden in plain sight, but also, there's a way that people should kind of expound upon it. I guess when we're thinking about beauty, I guess the big question here is why? Like, why do we care? Why do we care about beauty? Why are we looking to um, ancient Greek myths from 4,000 years ago, or philosophy, or all these things? Why should we be interested or considerate of beauty and what it means for us as humans?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go big. Right, some big
Yes.
questions. I mean, so why beauty in ancient Greece? Well, this comes back to what I initially said about actually its presence in our culture today. So we can immediately see that we're still living with the kind of legacy of some Greek ideas of beauty. I mentioned that idea of looking like a Greek god. That in a kind of popular body culture today, that goes back to someone who's hailed as the kind of father of modern bodybuilding, a guy called Eugene Sandow in the 19th century, who used to pose in imitation of Greek gods and in imitation of classical statues, right? And what he was doing was actually kind of in line with this idea that we find already in the earliest Western literature, in Homer and Hesiod, composed in about 700 BCE, where to look like a god is proverbial for beauty. So it's really interesting that this very idea goes all the way back to our earliest Greek sources. So this is, why should we be interested in this question? Well, one answer to that question is in some way we're still living with it. So if we want to understand our contemporary society, we need to look into its deep roots, and that's one thing about how we think about the beauty of the body is relevant there. Another so it's interesting. The subject of beauty, it kind of fell on quite hard times during the 20th century, right? So during the modernist movement from the late 19th through the 20th century, beauty kind of came under attack, and in particular, a particular ideal of beauty, and this is in particular a kind of classical ideal of beauty. So the neoclassicism of the 18th and 19th centuries kind of came under attack as a something to break away from, and that was part of the driving force behind the modernist art movement. Since the emergence of postmodernism from the 1990s onwards, that has seen a kind of renewed engagement with our classical heritage, with Greco-Roman antiquity. And beauty has kind of come back since the 1990s as a subject which art historians are interested in, as a subject of philosophical engagement as well. and even kind of making inroads in the sciences. So, in the last couple of decades, there's been this emergent field of neuroaesthetics, which is, actually studying the structures of our brain and how they produce experiences of beauty and so on. So beauty has kind of made a big comeback. And in that big comeback, the kind of heritage of beauty in ancient Greece has kind of been lying there, kind of under the surface, but it has been there. In particular, with Plato and his ideas about beauty, you can't sort of get away from Plato. So there's this famous line by a philosopher that the quote is, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato." And when it comes to beauty, there's a lot of truth in that big claim. So that's another thing. If we want to think about beauty now, we have to engage with Plato. And as I would see it, the focus of my book is actually on the period, it runs up to Plato, but it's really focusing on the period before Plato. So what I'm saying is, where did Plato get his ideas about beauty from? And so if we want to understand that, we have to look even deeper. There are various other aspects in which that kind of legacy of beauty today, and hence why we should engage with it, why we should engage with ancient Greek ideas about beauty is still present. Another is in relation to architecture. So there's a lot of talk right now, about the building beautiful classical architecture and the politics involved in that. That whole debate runs all the way back to the neoclassicism of the 18th and 19th centuries. But what we're actually talking about, these forms of classical architecture, like the columns and the pediments and the antefixes and all the things that are so familiar in our visual culture, not just in the West but across the world, a lot of these architectural forms first appeared during the Archaic period, which is the focus of my book, on temples which were designed to honor and to house gods. And so if we want to really understand the kind of the deep visual history behind this, this visual world that we live in today, we have to go right back to there. And what we might find is that how they thought about beauty, and say beauty in relation to Greek temples, may well throw up a kind of foil, a point of contrast to our own ideas about beauty. And that's really what, as I see it, one of the important things is that the period that I'm looking at was so formative because of its legacy for how we think about beauty now. So that's one thing. But the other is that it also, because it's such an alien culture in many ways, separated by thousands of years, it holds up a kind of point of contrast to how we think about beauty now. And that's really useful for a kind of exercise in self-reflection as much as anything.
I mean, we'll talk about the architecture piece, but I guess the one thing is that, I've lived around, Washington, D.C. and Baltimore to the north, but in D.C. we have temples erected. We have the Lincoln Memorial, right? We have the Jefferson Memorial to a lesser extent. I guess the Supreme Court building a little bit. These are another hint that if the architecture was, let's make this beautiful for the gods, what does that mean if people in a more modern period are just kind of ripping off of that or sort of cosplaying that a little bit? Is there something there where it's like, they're just trying to make a statement of this is how important these things are? Or I guess a little bit, how does that trickle down? Because obviously it's not a one-to-one thing where it's like, yeah, we're building a temple for a god. But the idea that you're going to use the same kind of style in a very, very, much removed period, namely in the 19th century, I guess. Is that not defiling it, but is it saying like, it's not that there's only one use, but it's like, initially we get these ideas in terms of architecture for, to please the gods, but, now we're just doing it for ourselves, or is it trying to make a statement that like, the founding fathers, I guess, from the United States context, or, Lincoln do sort of become these semi-deities of sorts. Washington and Lincoln and Jefferson, I guess, are kind of revered. Is that the kind of aim or goal, or is it just purely, it looks cool, and people wanted to, harken back to, something so majestic of sorts. I mean, what do you think
Yeah.
is the
I
the,
think
the, the piece there?
I don't think there's any single answer to that because classical architecture and its elements are used so widely, in the modern world today.
Mm-hmm.
From something that's quite obviously riffing on it, like the Lincoln Memorial, which looks like a
Yeah.
kind of classical Greek temple,
Yes.
to houses that you see across the world that have like little columns in front and a little
Mm-hmm.
pediment. In that case, it's not so obviously that they're kind of like drawing on this idea that the house is a temple or something like that. It's more that these architectural forms are deeply embedded in our own culture. They are our own now as well, and they also bear a set of associations which are like hundreds, thousands of years old for us now, which is very different from how they were when they first appeared. So when you use them, you're drawing on a very long tradition. Um, the thing that's often overlooked is that tradition is not immutable. So there's sometimes this kind of false notion that the classical tradition is, things were set in place and it was ever thus, and that's the way it should always be, right? And actually, the way that we engage with classical architecture is a conversation that's constantly evolving over time, and new ideas and new associations are evolving over time. So we're joining a part of a process. Is the way I would see it. In the case of the Lincoln Memorial specifically, I mean, there it does seem to me like it's deifying, this person,
Yeah.
right? He's there like
Yeah.
it really looks like a Greek temple. You go in and it's this colossal statue, which is modeled actually on Phaedius' statue of Zeus at Olympia. I mean, this is very definitely revering the god Lincoln.
It's the steps for me. It's
Yeah,
him on his throne, but he's above us, right? You're
yeah,
always looking up a bit, and it's the steps, I think, on
yeah,
the back side of it and the front side too. The front side looks over the whole city, and it's just so like, it's parallel to the Capitol building.
yeah,
It's just
yeah. He's
it
watching
is it,
over you.
he's watching over us. Yeah, it's very, very purposeful, and it's like, yeah, who got that real estate? And it's like, well, the only person that's going to get it is going to be Lincoln. The only person that, no matter how much people try to humanize the guy, um, people still see him as this might be apocryphal, but I read somewhere that outside of Jesus, Lincoln has the most books written about him. I mean, there's just people
Wow.
endlessly. I don't know if it's true or not, but he certainly has. I mean, every couple of months, there's 5 new books written about the guy. He didn't live that long. He lived 55 years or whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's very much for the United States, I guess. He's the big guy.
Yeah, and but that
Um,
question of like constantly doing that's how you create the god in a way, by constantly reiterating that
mm,
legacy
hmm
and
hmm
creating something in the imagination, right? That's almost
Yeah,
impossible to
it's
do.
that, and it's anytime. I mean, some people, I think historians try to be careful of this kind of presentism, but
Mm.
anytime something happens in at least the United States history, it's like, well, what would Lincoln say, or how did he do this in his time, and how's that parallel with It's just you see so much of that now too, which is also interesting. Again, it I think to your point, it further kind of deifies the man. Um, so okay, so I mean, it's just sort of a little bit philosophical before we get to the kind of, I guess, real, meat of the book here. But
Mm.
you mentioned in the beginning. Tell us about this differentiation, I guess. If there, I mean, obviously there's overlap, but between beauty and the aesthetic.
Mm.
For me, I see the aesthetic as wrapped up in perception and phenomenology. But of course, many people, including Kant, talked about the aesthetes. All these things. Aesthetics were important later in philosophy,
Mm.
but this is hard to quantify. I mean, what is it? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The whole thing, right? Like, what's beautiful or aesthetically pleasing to you might be different for me. There is a subjective component, and yet there isn't, right? So you sort of talk about sort of the subjective piece, definitely the subjective, but I'm more curious about what's the experience, right? The phenomenology of beauty and the aesthetic. There's something that you can't quite quantify. And the reason I guess, I mean, I think I'm assuming it's in the book, and the reason I'm asking is because that's what it seems the ancient Greeks are trying to do. They're trying to build these gods. They're giving uh, offerings or sacrifices. They're talking. They're writing things down. They're having songs. They're having all these things to quantify, this element of beauty. So, yeah, how do we understand these kind of components between the aesthetic and beauty?
Yeah. Um, yeah, difficult. So it might be
Yeah.
useful to have some context, a little bit of
Hmm.
historical background. Like when we say aesthetics, what are we even talking about? Because
Hmm.
it's a contested term. So aesthetics emerged as an independent branch of philosophy in the mid 18th century, and the term was coined by a German philosopher called Baumgarten. Aesthetics from actually a Greek verb, "aisthenomai," which means "I perceive." And that tells you something about how he understood what aesthetics was about. For Baumgarten, it was the kind of the science or the philosophy of sensory perception and taste. So very broad. And so beauty is a part of taste and sensory perception. So it fitted within that. And actually, for the rest of the 18th century, in particular with Kant, his Critique of Judgment, which is one of the most important aesthetic texts ever
Yeah.
written,
Yeah.
aesthetics retained this kind of very broad scope as to what it was about. It was about sensory perception and taste. Um, and then, really over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th, aesthetics became more focused on the philosophy of the fine arts. And the reason it became focused on that is because the arts were seen as the kind of privileged domain of beauty and taste. So, for that reason, actually, even still now, when you say aesthetic, when people talk about aesthetic this or the aesthetics of, often it's used in a way that's kind of synonymous with artistic,
Mm.
because of this one important branch of aesthetics, which is as the kind of philosophy of the fine arts. My view is that actually it's more profitable to think about aesthetics as this kind of broader conception, as it was in its origin, as concerned with, at its core, how we perceive and experience the world. So it's about the processes of sensory perception and our affective responses to the world, and the associated values that emerge from that, like beauty and so on. Now, from that perspective, the aesthetic is not artistic, but it's rather about the character of our experience.
Mm.
So it's about, whether if I look at something, what's my affective response? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it neutral? So in the positive camp, we might be thinking about terms like, beautiful and sublime and this kind of stuff. In the negative camp, it might be ugly, disgusting, painful, so on. In the neutral camp, it might be plain, dreary. So this is like the aesthetic covers all of those evaluative judgments that we have. And those evaluative judgments they're not just to do with art, they're part of everyday life, right? The choices I make when I put on my clothes, how you lay a dinner table, where you choose to go on holiday, you name it. These kind of aesthetic perceptions, I would see, these kind of evaluative judgments guide and define how we relate to the world consistently. So that's how I would present the aesthetics. And in that, I'm building on a recent development within the field called everyday aesthetics, which argues that the aesthetic is not limited to art, but it's part of our everyday lives. From that perspective, then, beauty is within the realm of the aesthetic. It's still big, but it's not quite as big as it's just the aesthetic in itself. Um, Now, beauty, if you're a historian and you want to look at beauty in ancient Greece or beauty in whatever historical society, then you need some kind of working definition, right? The challenge is that we can all see that beauty changes over time, right? Even what beauty was in the 19th and the 18th centuries is not what it is today. And how people have thought about and philosophers have talked about beauty also lays the concept with a certain baggage that evolves over time, right?
Mm.
So if we accept that beauty is this changing thing, then that also raises the question as to, well, what stays the same,
Yeah,
right?
what's constant? Yeah.
Yeah, what's
Mhm.
constant?
Mhm.
Is it even justifiable to talk about any concept in ancient Greece as beauty if you're also saying that it's historically specific and culturally contingent? Um, So there I've led myself into the problem of having to define beauty, which is always
I'm sure it's very easy to do, isn't
it? Exactly. So in this, it might be good to invoke a Greek proverb, which is "beautiful things are difficult." I sort of sound that as a note of like humility for one thing. Beautiful things are difficult, and they're difficult to define. One difficulty about beauty is that beautiful things are incredibly diverse, right? So sights can be beautiful, sounds can be beautiful, people can be beautiful, ideas can be beautiful, so on and so on and so on. So that raises the question of what do all these things have in common? And the answer is that beautiful things may have very little in common besides how they are perceived. So at its kind of core, beauty pertains to the pleasing way in which things appear to us. Right? Beautiful things attract and hold our attention because they please us. Now, that's a very simple definition. The extra difficulty of beauty is that it's not just limited to pleasure. So that kind of essential element of pleasure in the experience of beauty can be coupled with any number of different kind of affective responses, right? Beauty can be delightful, it can be desirable, it can inspire fear, it can be saddening, there can be terrifying beauty, you name it. So it's incredibly sort of broad. So pleasure combines with a whole range of other different affective responses in the experience of beauty. The one thing you can say is that beauty makes its presence felt. There's no ignoring beauty. So one way of understanding what beauty is it demands to be noticed, right? The final thing I would say in terms of a general definition of beauty is related to the question of value. So when you see something as beautiful, it immediately confers a kind of value on that thing that is beautiful.
But you see it as removed from that? Like, is it? I don't want to say impossible, but the pushback there is well, maybe things are beautiful and they don't have value. They operate in some other kind of space. I'm not saying I agree with. I think that I think yes. I think the value is. I don't think there's an objective value, but maybe people could argue on that. But could you untether beauty and value, or no? Would that be very hard to do?
I don't think you could in terms of your experience. If you're actually seeing something as beautiful, then you're already registering the value of that thing, right? So someone could tell me the Lincoln Memorial is beautiful, right? And I might say, okay, and let's say I've never seen it, right? I just have to agree with you that that's the case and that it has a certain aesthetic value. But it's not until I see it and judge whether it's beautiful or not that I'm going to feel its value. And that's the different, when I'm talking about value here, that's why it's different from, say, the value of $1 in my pocket, right? The value of $1 in my pocket, it doesn't actually have any value other than the one that we ascribe to it and we decide, we agree together, this thing has value. Whereas when it comes to beauty, there's no second-hand judgments of it. It's like, no, when I see something as beautiful, there is its value. So the experience of beauty confers value on that thing. So that's how I would, and that very broad definition of beauty that I just gave is, it permits endless kind of cultural variations. So there's so many different takes in different cultures on what that actually looks like, on what different cultures say is beautiful, how people respond to them, the different ways they're embedded in different societies, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's a path I can see walking down on this concept of value and beauty, but I'll avoid that because we could talk for 3-4 hours, which I wouldn't mind, but I don't know if it sounds very, very fascinating. I'll definitely marinate on that. Yeah. So okay, I think that's very helpful. It's a good way of kind of setting the table. So. Okay, when we're talking about beauty, as we've already kind of talked around it a little bit, but kind of head on here. With the ancient Greeks, beauty becomes inseparable from defining or describing the gods, right? And we'll come on to the interaction between gods and humans in a bit, but how did that become the standard of immeasurable beauty? Because okay, I mean, spoiler, the gods don't exist. There's no Zeus. There's no, there's no
He's not going to be happy with
Agamemnon.
you,
There's
Xavier.
there's no Poseidon. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. They don't
Not going to be
really
happy.
exist. Spoiler. Sorry. um, so obviously there are humans a long time ago that probably thought they existed or some version of that or something like that. But these are, you can have the higher aim or the appeal or whatever, but let's just take it for what it is. For the gods, they become the standard of immeasurable beauty. And you also mentioned that many Near Eastern cultures had similar esteem placed on beauty for the gods. So where does this theme of immortality connect here? This standard of beauty? How do we see high beauty and the gods? Is it like a kind of um, um, aspirational thing for humans that we've created? But what can we say here about this?
Yeah. Well, first thing, we should probably atone to Zeus because he's going to be mighty angry. Um, yeah, so that's a great question. So, why do we see this general association between gods and the beautiful? Like, this is common in many cultures. It's not just a Greek thing.
Mhm.
I mean, one answer to that question, as you described, you put it in aspirational terms. Gods tend to acquire the ideals, the values that we hold dear, and we project onto them as humans. So that's one way of understanding why studying religion is so indicative of a society, and a religion with gods in it at least. So it's kind of projecting human values onto the divine plane. That's one way of seeing it. Specifically in relation to what you said about immortality, so the relationship between divine beauty and immortality, what's the link there?
Mhm.
In the Greek context, I think there's something quite specific going on there, which is that there's this deep tendency in Greek culture to link beautiful appearance with one's inner nature in some way. That it's sometimes seen as a complicated relationship between outer appearance and inner nature, but there's a tendency to want to link them in some way, that somehow they should be connected. And when it comes to the gods, I think there is a very deep connection between those two things, which is that so the Greek gods, the strange thing that they're not eternal, they are born. There was a time when Zeus didn't exist, and so on and so on. They come into the world, they have a very brief period of childhood, they quickly reach their prime, and then they just sort of stay there. So they are, in Greek terms, they are immortal and ageless.
I mean, this is the ideal, right? We all want to be,
Right.
whatever, pick your age, 35, 40, whatever it is, with, just to be there forever.
Well, there you go. And actually, that makes the point again about us projecting onto gods what we really want. Okay,
Right.
so that's great. So gods being immortal and ageless, so they reach their prime, so they have youth in perpetuity. For that reason, because youth is associated with beauty in ancient Greece, they kind of reach their physical and aesthetic peak, and then they just stay there. So in that way, their beauty is actually a reflection of their immortal and ageless nature. The contrast with humans then appears because, unfortunately, we don't just stay at 35 or whatever your ideal
No,
is.
no, we do not. We do not. Our body will tell us very, very quickly. And so I guess how do we I guess I'll bring it here just since it kind of connects. How do we see this like idea, this relationship between the gods and
Mm.
humans? You talk about this in the book about like that kind of interaction is important. I mean, I think one of the things I was thinking about when reading it was like, well, can we really only understand the beauty of deities if they're juxtaposed with human beauty? Almost like using it. But the bigger meta question here is are we just having a conversation with ourselves? Here's the ideal, here's the aspirational thing. I want to have a Greek god's body and I want to be 35 forever and I want to be strong and sexy and appealing and all these things. But I have my body, which is not those things. And I am going to get old and I have all these things. But is it always that, right? Of this, relationship between beauty's power with gods and humans, that you can look at some similarities, but also underscores their essential differences. What is this kind of relationship? And I'll tack on here. And what is the bounds and limits of beauty, or especially human beauty? That it's not this ever increasing expanse. It's there has to be bounds and limits to it. So yeah, talk about these dynamics.
Yeah, so I mean, the first principle that's probably important just to make plain, which is no doubt familiar to many listeners, is that Greek gods were anthropomorphic, by which I mean they had human form. So gods and humans share a kind of human body. Actually, in Greek mythology, as in the Bible, it goes the other way around in that humans are modelled on the form of gods, right?
Yeah, right.
But that's important because that is actually
Right.
more in tune with the Greek way of looking at the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if we today might not think it's necessarily correct. So gods and humans share a body, and for that share a human form, and for that reason, when humans reach their peak, when we're at our peak, our youthful kind of peak, we can come close. This is what you find in Greek epic and throughout Greek literature, that humans can kind of come close in form to the gods. They can be godlike in appearance. There's this word theoides in Greek. They can be godlike in appearance, which is to be beautiful, to be youthful and beautiful. At that point, in the kind of like the pinnacle of our human existence, we approximate to come close to the gods. And that's a really important idea in Greek culture and in Greek religion, because it shows that there's this potential for commensurability, solidarity, affinity between gods and humans, that we're not so different after all, that there's this moment when we come close. The thing is, though, as we alluded to before, that human beauty is transient, whereas divine beauty is permanent, right? And so that's why, for this reason, that beauty is actually a way in which physical beauty is a way in which gods and humans are assimilated. It's a way in which they're likened, but it also becomes a way of visually defining their essential difference from one another. Because the fact that human beauty fades is a reflection of the fact that we grow old and die, which is precisely what gods do not do. And I think to really bring these ideas into focus, there's one myth, which is, I mean, it's so poignant, it's really powerful. So the myth is about a hero called Tithonus, who was a Trojan, incredibly beautiful, and it said that he was as beautiful as a god. He was in form like the gods, and because of that, because he was so beautiful, he was desired by a goddess, so the goddess Dawn. Dawn in Greek mythology, by the way, is especially horny. Make of that what you will. But so Dawn fancies Tithonus, and so they begin a relationship together. They're sleeping together, and so on. And Dawn loves Tithonus so much that she goes to Zeus and asks to make him immortal. Right? And Zeus says, okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, Tithonus can be immortal if that's all you want. And Dawn goes, yeah, that's all I want. So Zeus makes him Tithonus immortal. Crucially, Dawn forgets to ask to make Tithonus ageless as well. So the thing about Greek gods, as I said before, is they're not just immortal, they're also ageless. So she says, make Tithonus immortal. She forgets to say, make him ageless. So what happens is that Tithonus never dies, but he just keeps on aging and aging and aging and aging. Eventually, to the point where Dawn just finds him so disgusting to look at this point that she locks him away. And actually, in this myth, this is how the cicada comes into being. So Tithonus turns into a cicada. And that's why cicadas make all that noise at dawn. It's a kind of wonderful story. So next time you see a cicada, have in mind. But what the story brings out is that beauty is a way of kind of visually expressing the relationship between gods and humans, and also that it's very deeply tied to this question of inner nature, the fact that we age, but gods do not.
Two questions here on this. So a little different, but the one question here is, some people might listen to this and say, yeah, but, this was a long time ago. And, we have problems on fixating on external beauty in modern society. There's, you can get different types of surgeries and all types of cosmetics, and you can, do all of these things to your body to just enhance a certain kind of cultural standard or ideal. And this is terrible. This is terrible for young, boys and girls. This is terrible for all these standards to have them try to meet something they won't. Nobody's happy in their own body. They should be happy. All these things.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we look at the deeper, or what does the story from the ancients tell us about beauty that's rich and deep and meaningful, and not this vapid, hollow, shallow idea of beauty that's sort of a kind of McDonald's version of it in modern society? I mean, it feels like the Greeks are thinking about it a little bit deeper than just, what. So, and I don't want to infuse something that's not there. Maybe they were thinking of it that way, but how do we understand some of those sorts of critique, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, one way of saying, the story that I just described, one thing that it does seem to show is that, the loss of beauty is painful. So in that respect, when people are anxious about, oh, I'm getting wrinkles and I'm getting older and my youthful beauty is fading and want to do something, actually, that's something that humans have always worried about. So that's one thing. There's as I would see it, there's some comfort in that you're not kind of alone in those worries and those concerns.
Yeah.
The issue I would see is in trying to hold on to something that is running through your fingers, right, and that will disappear. And on that, I think actually there is some wisdom to be found from the ancient world. So in particular, there's a line from Aristotle who says that there's a type of beauty appropriate to each age of life. So there's a kind of youthful beauty.
It's really nice.
And but then there's also a kind of middle-aged beauty. But then there's also actually a kind of old beauty too.
Yeah.
And if you try to hold on to that model of youthful beauty when you're not, then maybe actually you're neglecting the possibility, denying the possibility of kind of embodying middle-aged beauty or even old beauty, and so on and so on and so on. I think that's that's how I would kind of see it. Yeah.
I guess the other, I like that. I mean, obviously, Aristotle has had some bangers, so he's had some lines, he's had some bars. Yeah, he's great. I guess the other thing is about this sort of, in terms of beauty and how we understand it, is how much of it is it's in the body, but how much do we see past that? And we see, I mean, again, we've been emphasizing, love, desire, things like that, physically. But what about the inside stuff? What about what's beautiful inside? Right? Can you see me as beautiful for who I am, my personality, my how I think and how I express things? Like, is it only external, right? And yeah, sure, we can see beauty in our 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe even 80s. But what about all the good stuff inside? How do we see? What do the Greeks tell us about the beauty that we have from within us? I'm going to assume here that there's a sort of relationship there, right? That not always, but a lot of it is manifested externally in our beauty. So how do we see the inside outside kind of thing in terms of beauty? This is not just physical appearance or these things, but the other pieces of temperament and character and personality and all these things. What do the ancients tell us on this aspect of beauty?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised this, because this goes to the heart of a really important aspect of Greek views on beauty. So I mentioned earlier that there's this kind of deep tendency to want to link inner nature and outer appearance in some way. And there is actually a single term in Greek which kind of encapsulates this. The term is kalokagathia, which means literally the beautiful and the good thing, or kalos, or the adjective kalos kagathos, which means the beautiful and the good. So this is the idea that somehow there's a kind of equation between physical beauty and inner nature, between goodness. And actually there's one of the most common Greek words for beautiful, kalos, can mean beautiful in the sense of physically attractive. And it can also in other contexts mean something like good or appropriate. So there is this kind of like deep link between goodness and beauty. Um, and I mean, I think this in a lot of scholarship, this has been taken too far. Like the points that I just mentioned have made people wonder whether the Greeks could even differentiate between
Mm,
outer beauty and inner goodness.
mm,
What we find from the earliest literature onwards in Homer is that they certainly could, and that actually there were many people who somehow contradicted this ideal equation. There are people like Paris, who's a beautiful Trojan hero, who's nonetheless a bit of a coward and shirks from the battle, and he kind of doesn't live up to his looks. And that's a really interesting idea that if you behave in a certain way and you're beautiful, you're disgracing your looks. You're disgracing the
mm,
expectation that your beauty should have. From the other side, right, there is also a trend or a way of thinking in ancient Greece that um, if you behave in a certain way that's morally excellent, then it will show a kind of beauty as well. So Sappho, there's this line of Sappho which she says, um, "There's one person who is beautiful only insofar as appearances are concerned, and then there's someone else who will behave in such a way that will make them beautiful." So there is this idea, there's this kind of, the Greeks are kind of in various ways working through and wrestling with these ideas of the relationship between inner beauty and outer beauty. One of the kind of the ultimate examples of this is actually Socrates,
mm,
who was famously ugly,
mhm,
had like a big bulbous eyes and big nose and all this stuff.
mhm,
And he's kind of, but the point is that is the beauty of his soul. So unlike the
mm,
young Alcibiades, who he tries to teach philosophy and doesn't really get very far, he's beautiful on the outside, but well, his character leaves much to be desired. Socrates is kind of the opposite, where yeah, he's pretty ugly on the outside, but actually the beauty of his soul is just radiant.
mm. Yeah, I feel like, in a modern context, people kind of will say that, like, yeah, this person's, they're gorgeous, they're beautiful, but they kind of suck. Their personality sucks. Like, they're not, they're not fun to be around. They're always a downer. They, whatever. And over time, that does seep through. I mean, there's always this inside outside thing going on. I feel like with
Yeah.
humans, where sure you can objectively say certain dimensions or certain measurements or certain whatever of beauty, but at the end it is based on each person, but also it is that kind of inside outside, which I think is important. So there's all these higher themes of beauty is connected to value, beauty is connected to certain aspects of character, which is it's not just the but through that, it doesn't minimize the external aspects, which I think is important too. Of well, let's make something or create something beautiful, whether that's in with other things you talk about in the book, which is you know music, chorus, hymns, songs, poems. What we build, like it takes a long time to build those, those those temples in Greece. So if someone was like, so this is beautiful, and we'll give it a shot. I mean, those things take years, right? It is important. It is important to make something look beautiful, but I think it is also what it's connected to, right? And so that way when you're like, well, I don't want to do this, or oh, it's been a hard week. It's like, yeah, but this is valuable. This is important, and that has a kind of, I think, staying power there. The one piece here, we can talk about some of that real quick, but I wanted to ask about what I thought was super interesting. I never thought about it. Is you talk about beauty as power, uh, and I never thought of it that way. And you mentioned the gods use their beauty as power. Um, so I guess the question is, what kind of power? There's different types,
Mm.
and why?
Mm.
Or I guess more appropriate, how? How is beauty powerful?
Yeah.
What is that like?
Mm. Yeah, so this is in particular in the context where I'm looking at early Greek epic, so
Mm-hmm.
the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Hesiod, and so on. And one thing you see there, especially actually in, well, no, actually in all of those early Greek epics, is there's an emphasis on beauty's effects. So beauty is powerful by nature. The ultimate example of that would be Helen of Troy, who's the most beautiful Greek
That's what
heroine.
people went to war for. These
Exactly,
men
right?
went to war for how beautiful she was. I
Exactly.
mean,
There you go. It's about the agency of beauty, the power of beauty. So the most beautiful woman is the most, in a sense, the one that exerts the most power over people. And there's a scene in the Iliad where the Trojan elders go, "God, she really is beautiful. It's no shame that we have been killing each other for so long over a woman like this." That kind of like sums it up, right? Um, as for the gods, so the gods harness that kind of power of beauty, that affective power of beauty, to their own ends. One way we see this in the Odyssey is that Athena, one of her favorite ways of helping Odysseus and his family, is by beautifying them at particular moments. And she really chooses her moment where she sort of steps in, unbeknownst to Odysseus, and becomes his kind of personal beautician, and makes him exceptionally beautiful to help him in a particular social situation, because then his beauty he's seen as incredibly like enthralling and enticing to this young woman which ensures that he kind of his safe passage into their society and so on. So she uses kind of beauty with an awareness of its effects on others as a way to kind
but
of
but
control
but you could say
situation.
you could make the argument that it is using disguise and deception,
Yeah,
which is, we usually, I mean, I don't necessarily, but you usually see that as negative things.
right.
Those are immoral things. Those
Yeah,
are bad things.
yeah,
But it does. I mean, again, this is why we still read the Greeks. 2,000 years later, there is a particular moment and a particular purpose in a social context of why, knowing that the context of why that was important, and it makes you think more about, what does that mean for us? Are there moments for when we what can we gain from that
mm,
about how do you understand the social context, how we understand how we present, how we understand all these things?
mm.
It's very interesting.
Yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely. And I mean, I only gave you the positive, as it were, where Athena's trying to help Odysseus by beautifying them. But there are other instances where gods use the effects of beauty to harm others. And the most
Yeah.
famous case of that is the myth of Pandora, which is where Zeus intends to. At this point in the human race, only men exist,
Hmm.
and Zeus wants to punish mankind, and he does that by inventing the first woman, Pandora. And the way that this punishment works in this kind of incredibly misogynistic myth
Hmm.
is that the gods will make this woman, this maiden, who's so beautiful that men won't be able to resist her. But, and this is part of the myth, that it's actually her nature, like that she will steal, she'll be conniving, and so on and so on. But because she's so beautiful, men won't be able to resist being drawn to her and bound to her. So again, coming to that question of beauty and inner nature again, it's relevant to that whole topic, but it also makes a point about how beauty is kind of irresistible. It also says
Mm.
a lot about male fear of female seduction and all sorts of things.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting about how, you know we still have these ideas about. I just can't get out of my head this we have these, we create these ideas as an aspirational thing.
Mm,
But I think the thing about the ancients that's so interesting is that you can do it. You know, it's not quite secular, of course, by any means, but I feel like it could sit well in a secular humanist kind of framework more than maybe other religions. So again, not entirely, but
mm, mm,
um, I guess to that end, I mean, you talk about a lot of things in the book, and they're all very interesting. Like I mentioned, you talk about the use of music, and
mm,
you're giving offerings, and what's the relationship like in the natural world. We mentioned a little bit in the beginning about you spend a lot of time in the book actually on architecture and temples, which are super important. But this idea of design and form and decoration is super, kind of what I was alluding to as well. Is like that stuff mattered. It wasn't just like we're gonna put something together, and it's like no, it really was meant to be that way. But I guess what was the role of religion and types of theology that played an impact with ancient Greece and the emphasis on beauty. I mean, it does start to become. You talk about some of the cults, and you talk about some of the groups and things like that. These things start to take a life of their own.
Mm.
Um, is there? I guess one piece of this. I'm sort of framing this in a negative way, but there's a lot of wonderful things that the Greeks teach us about, the ancient Greeks teach us about beauty, but is there a dark side to that where you can overemphasize that, or you can become too aligned, or you have, yeah, I mean, I don't think cults are usually seen in a positive way. So
Mm.
I guess you're in one. So, but I don't, but, yeah, I mean, what's the role here of like, too much allegiance or too parochial in your thinking, or is there a darker side here?
Yes, I mean on the cult question. So I think this word, in its original definition, it means simply the worship of a god or a hero, and then in our popular culture, it's come to mean a kind of slightly creepy brainwashing scam of some sort. So
Yes, yes.
when in particular when historians of religion and ancient historians of religion use the term, they're not thinking of Scientology or something like that. It's simply the
Right.
worship of a god or a hero. And in that, I mean, is there a dark side? I mean, there's certainly dark sides to the gods. Those myths I've just told you about Pandora and so on would
Yeah.
bring that out pretty clearly. I think when it comes to the worship of gods and the role of beauty in that, a really important concept to understand is what's called charis. This kind of
Mm,
underpins the whole practice of Greek
mm,
religion. So why did why did why did humans worship gods in ancient Greece?
mm,
The simple answer to that question is because humans depended on them in all aspects of their life, for crops to grow, to ensure you have a good childbirth, to successful voyage over sea, a successful business venture, so on and so on and so on. Every aspect of life is controlled and maintained by a deity of one form or another, right? So gods are unavoidable. They are interwoven in every aspect of everyday life, and they are powerful. They control those parts of life, right? So for that reason, humans need to do whatever they can to please the gods, and this is where this concept of charis comes in. So that desire to please the gods and to maintain a kind of reciprocal relationship with them so that the gods are willing to kind of ensure that things go well for you. That's essentially why worshippers gave gods gifts of all kinds. And gifts, as I said, take many forms. One would be like a simple like drink offering, a libation. Another would be the performance of music or a song. The sacrifice of an animal is another absolutely key um, ritual act. Building temples, offering statues, all of these things are gifts which are offered in order to inspire the charis, which is the pleasure of the god. Um, Now, the interesting and complicated thing here is that charis, at its root, it means pleasure, but it also means some other things. So, a pleasing act from one person to another is also in Greek charis, okay? Because
mm,
it's if I were to offer you charis, Xavier, then I'm doing you a favor, right? Because I'm
mm,
giving you a kind of pleasure of some sort. The thing is that when an object can also have a certain charis, and then in that context, it really means something like beauty. So the charis of these earrings is that pleasurable quality of these earrings, right? I.e., their beauty. So when it comes to the role of beauty in Greek religion and in this system of gift giving that I described, the beauty of an object, its charis, its beauty, is hopes that it will inspire the pleasure of the god, i.e., their charis. So there's a kind of totally reciprocal relationship between the beauty of the offering and the pleasure felt by its divine recipient and their desire to give something back in return. Now, this whole kind of system of reciprocal gift giving in Greek religion, because there is this element of reciprocity in it, and because
mm,
humans did give things to gods in the hope of getting something in return, it's often framed as a kind of contractual thing, as almost like a
mm,
commercial relationship. Well, like, oh, well, I gave that offering to Zeus. Why didn't he give me back in return? Like, and I say it in a slightly jokey way, but that really is the kind of the tone, actually, of quite a lot of scholarship like that. And it's quite cynical in a way, but it overlooks the fact that, this is what I say to my students, gods are not vending machines. You don't just put in a gift and get your, you don't put your money in and get your thing out, get your product out. It doesn't work like that. It's aspirational, right? Because I can make the most beautiful offering in the world to a god, but because they're a god and they're capricious and they're largely unknowable, who knows how they're going to reply? They might be pleased, they might not be. So it is the whole system, which is encapsulated in this word charis, it is fundamentally aspirational. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Again, it's so, I think, important. I maybe it's just the piece of getting older, but I find that not just the ancient Greeks, other cultures as well. But I think the thing about the ancient Greeks is that they wrote stuff down, and they had a lot of things they left behind. So we get a lot from it. But there's so much relevance here. So I guess my final question here is what is the why? Well, why should people read your book? That's the first thing. But why should we continue to look to the ancient Greeks for a lot of information about things, including beauty? How does that still have some kind of relevance or value for us moderns in 2025? Why should we consider these things?
Yeah, it's a really important question, right? Something that if you're an ancient historian, you always need to be thinking about, right? Like,
of course,
who cares?
Right? Who cares? Why are we studying this from 400 BCE? Like, why do we? Right.
Yeah, I mean, so as I see it, so there are two things. One is about actually where we began this conversation about the legacy of many of these ideas, and this is something that, in particular, in the conclusion of the book, I try to show the kind of the legacy of this cultural dialogue between beauty and the gods as it runs up right to the present day. So that's one thing, is understanding, why do we think about beauty in the way that we do today, especially in the Western world? Why say if you're in DC, why do the buildings look like this? Well, actually, beauty in ancient Greece and its relationship with the divine is an important part of the answer to that question. And that question of legacy filters into many different aspects of life, and I hope that comes across in the book, because I mean one of my aims was to write quite broadly, right? So it covers literature, it covers philosophy, it looks at the natural landscape, it looks at temples, it looks at art, and so I hope that for people with different interests, there's something there that people can take out and also start to see its legacy. The other thing I would say is that it's not just about just about now. Is I think a lot of these these artworks, these buildings, these poems that I'm looking at, they are wonderful. They're wonderful to read, and they're also very alien in many ways. They feel familiar. This is the interesting thing about studying Greek and Greco-Roman antiquity in particular, is that there's a certain familiarity because of its reception, because it's a part of our culture today. But then it's also deeply alien, right? It's totally weird, right? When you open up Homer, and you're immediately in a completely different world, and that's useful because it shows how we've changed and how we're different, and understanding those continuities and differences through time. Well, that's part of understanding our humanity. So
I'm laughing. I'm totally laughing over here because I had a conversation with Daniel Mendelsohn. He did the Odyssey, the new English translation of the Odyssey. He said maybe almost verbatim the exact same thing.
Oh, amazing!
He said,
I promise it's not a setup.
He said, the Odyssey is still relevant because it's different and it's from another place and it's a bit alien, but it's familiar. It's about humanity and all these things. It's hilarious. It's hilarious. He said almost the same thing. It's funny, but it's true. I think it's totally accurate. So. Hugo, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. You really do have a fabulous book. Highly encourage folks to get out there and get it and read it. And I really appreciate you giving us your time and energy and wisdom. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.